Well, if it isn't the Bible geek, and I don't know who it is because it's somebody that looks a lot like him. All right, today's first question from Jay Tarnoff. Dr. Price, I was listening to the June 8th podcast where you again spoke about the Marcion Paul tradition of learning the gospel through divine revelation versus the Catholic interpretation of divine instruction from the 12 in Jerusalem, that is, Galatians versus 1 Corinthians. I have previously read The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man and Deconstructing Jesus, where I believe you provide very good evidence for the mythological Jesus, or at least lay the foundation that all of the acts of Jesus are syncretisms from various earlier dying and rising God myths. If one begins with the assumption that the Jesus figure is simply a constructed mytheme, how valid is the historicity of any of the individuals associated with Jesus? I know the list of the 12 vary depending on the source, so I figure that the historicity is already in question on the 12. But do we have any evidence that any of these figures actually existed, that is, besides relics in churches? Properly, with sneer quotes around the relics. I think there are independent lines of evidence for the existence of a Marcion, whom you identify with Paul, that is the first writer of Pauline epistles. In the early church. If evidence points to an existence of a Marcion/Paul, then how much evidence does this provide for the idea that this man went to Jerusalem to talk to someone who believed they were part of an early inner circle of Christianity? Since the divine revelation of the gospel would be an untenable hypothesis, it would seem the alternative hypothesis is that Marcion/Paul potentially heard something about a figure named Jesus from his peers and eventually made the rest up. What is generally considered the historical evidence for Marcion/Paul? Von Kampenhausen in Fathers of the Church only provides a historical account as far back as Justin and Irenaeus for the Greek Church and Tertullian for the Roman Church. Finally, as a much broader question, what is generally considered the threshold for assigning historicity to an individual in general? I know this would depend upon the sources as well as converging lines of evidence, but do scholars of history have any sort of demarcation point for being relatively sure of a historical figure? Thanks again for the great podcast, Jay Tarnoff. Well, let's see. A lot of good questions there. My guess is that, for one thing, the witnesses to Paul, the ones that have, or to Marcion, actually, explicitly, those would be the ones you named from Von Kampenhausen, Justin, Martyr, Tertullian, Irenaeus. There are various other reports and attempted refutations and so on, such as Esnik of Armenia and various debates and apologies and things like that, bits and pieces, but those are the most substantial ones. Sometimes it's not absolutely clear you've got the same Marcion in mind. Oddly enough, there's a Marcion mentioned in the martyrdom of Polycarp, and the famous Marcion is linked. But those are probably the earliest. There's something in Papias as well that links Marcion with the writing of the Gospel of John. Fascinating stuff. Well, let's see now. What else? Any adjacent figures to Jesus likely to be historical? Well, I think the 12 are not. I think that Eisenman is right, and that these characters, if you want to call them that, and they're not really characters, names really, have been derived from the names of the heirs, of the pillars, the dynasty that among the early Jewish church that traced itself back to Jesus. Now, it's possible there was such a group, and that there was a succession dispute with the successors of people known as the 12. Once such a list had been created, that would mean there might have been a James the Just. There are various patristic references to him, and possibly one in Josephus if it's authentic. Then there's, that would mean Simeon Bar Cleophas, the brother of James, and perhaps Judas Thomas. Some take the Thomas Apocrypha seriously enough to believe that there was a Thomas, and there could have been. Some of these characters could have been drawn in from other circles, like we have the more or less contemporary Qumran-style Jewish medical text that has Yohanan ben Zabdi, or John, son of Zebedee, as its hero. It's Marcus Welby character. He may have been borrowed by the gospel tradition from there. Who knows? It's very difficult to say. Simon Peter, for the little we hear of him, has already adopted mythological associations. Arthur Drobs wrote a book, The Legend of Simon Peter, and Frank Zindler translated it, and it's available from American Atheist Press. Then it's not unlikely that Apollos is another name for Apollonius of Tyana, who's been drawn into the Christian orbit. Generally speaking, it doesn't look that optimistic. Now, who is it that Marcion, let's put it this way, who lies at the bottom of the Galatian story of the Council of Jerusalem, with Paul going to see those who were apostles before him to get him to check out his gospel, and they seem to have a deal, but and it involves him providing a lot of money, but then it breaks down. Well, part of the strength of the case of seeing a Marcionite character to Galatians is seeing this episode as reflecting Marcion's own trip to Rome to join the church and be approved and perhaps become bishop, bringing a huge donation, which was then slightly later turned down, given back to him, and the agreement breaks down. So if that is the prototype for it historically, then again, the 12 are simply fictitious characters, or the pillars, James, John, and Peter, Cephas, are fictive counterparts to the bishops of Rome. So nothing much comes up there either. I've often wondered, however, if it's possible that we might have something like we do with the Ascended Masters in Theosophy. Madame Blavatsky was all the time talking about getting messages from the White Brotherhood in their lodge, and that they were immortals transfigured in the past, and she gave all manner of names, more or less Indian to them, like Kut Humi and Moriael and so forth. And one scholar's done the research to find out that though there were no ancient people she knew of that corresponded to these names, they were all references to people Madame Blavatsky actually did know, gods and bodhisattvas of the Theosophical Society. And I wonder occasionally if certain apostles began that way as early leaders of the church, and how, for instance, Stephen Davies in his great book, The Revolt of the Widows, the Social World of the Apocryphal Acts of the Apostles, he says that in the Apocryphal Acts, Acts of Andrew, Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul, and so on, he says that really what we're reading there is based on the exploits of these itinerant 2nd century apostles and prophets, the kind mentioned in the Didache, who preached the gospel of celibacy. However, we are reading these things collected and attributed to these fictive apostles of the New Testament. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, and again, that would kind of fit that idea like in Theosophy. The Ascended Masters are based on actual people, but their representation in the New Testament is fictive. So a very good question. Now, how do we determine the historicity of any name appearing in a historical or ostensibly historical report? Well, I would say the easiest cases are those where it doesn't matter whether they were historical or not. Like if you have a few names in a list population record or whatever, people in a political administration or anything like that, townspeople, where no point is being made about them. Probably those are just the last echoes of now insignificant people, so that there'd be no reason to challenge their historicity, but it isn't getting you anything either. It's the interesting characters in history that present more of a difficulty. All the more if they are surrounded by miracle stories. That appears to be theological coloring, obviously. If their stories correspond to well-known literary prototypes, even if they're not miraculous, you start to wonder. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't exist. You do have parallels between Abe Lincoln and John Kennedy, for sure, and they really happened. But you might wonder. I mean, it's easy to settle the doubts in that case, but in some other ones it's not, and you really do have to leave it open. Could history have repeated itself? Yeah, but you have enough of that, and you begin to wonder, and maybe that's all you can do. These things are not open and shut cases. Also, you mentioned the converging lines of evidence. That's important. Multiple attestation, as they say. If there would be no propaganda reason to mention or even embellish such persons, if there's nothing particularly objectionable then from that standpoint to make it suspicious, yeah, why not? If somebody is mainly a propaganda object, like Horst Wessel, the great Wessel, if you want to pronounce it that way, in Nazi propaganda. This guy was the ideal citizen of Nazi Germany, an indefatigable worker for the party and all that. Well, there was great doubt among scholars for a long time, and this is a pretty recent period, right? There was great doubt as to whether there actually was a Horst Wessel, and it turns out apparently there was, but who knows what he was really like, because most of it was a product of the propaganda machine. So if someone is promoted as being some kind of figurehead, an example, then you begin to brand embodiment like Bartles and James or Mickey Mouse or Ronald McDonald. But the less controversy, the less apparent literary prototype and resemblance and parallel, then the less difficulty with it. There are spectacular characters. It's doubtful there was a King David or a King Arthur, but there does seem to have been an Alexander the Great. Don't want to say only the dull and insignificant ever happened. Very good set of questions, Jay.